All right. Good afternoon, everybody. First off, I just want to say thank you to the organizers, and also thank you to the Ethereum research community. It's a fantastic community where I've learned a ton, and I wouldn't be here without them. And finally, just want to thank these folks that I have listed on stage, Christopher Ghost, Dee, and John Gurl, and other people who work on Anoma. While I will be talking about tools for socioeconomic coordination, I will not be talking about Anoma specifically, so if you want to talk about that, you can come find me after. All right, let's get started. So in this talk, we'll have three parts. In the first part, we'll talk about socioeconomics and cybernetics. In the second part, we'll talk about some crypto problems. And then in the final part, we'll conjecture some tools that can help handle some of these problems, potentially. It's going to be rather speculative, so bear with me. All right, tools. So this last week, I was in ETH Berlin, and when I got to ETH Berlin, they gave me a carry-on bag, kind of like a toiletry bag that you would find in an American drugstore. And I opened the bag, and it had a black pair of slippers and a head and a neck scarf. And I said to myself, why are they giving me this? But then it sunk in. These are tools for a digital nomad. And as it turns out, I had actually left my toiletry bag at home prior to the trip. And later that evening, when I was in my hotel and I wanted something comfy, I put those slippers on. And when I went for a run, I used the headscarf to tie my hair back. Similarly, if you were building a house, you might use tools like a hammer, a saw, a paintbrush, nail gun. And if you were an Ethereum dApp builder, you might use tools like Solidity, Foundry, Ethers, or OpenZeppelin. So one major thing you can do with tools is that they give you the means to change the system. They might seem like they have a very minor impact, but that minor impact can expand. Similarly, like a butterfly in India that flaps its wings and eventually causes a hurricane. So I'm going to read you this quote. In doing some research for this talk, I was reading this paper on art and culture in ideological systems, and I found this to be quite relevant. So in an ideological system, agents can have heterogeneous goals, beliefs, and behaviors, and interact with each other through communication and persuasion, socialization and mobilization, and these interactions create feedback loops that reinforce and modify the behavior and level of use of resources. All right, so this has to do with socioeconomic systems. And what's interesting about socioeconomic systems is that they involve policies that are usually set by some policymakers, and they also impact people. And it's this interaction between the policies and the behaviors of people that form somewhat of a feedback loop. And this feedback loop can be thought of as cause and effect, whereby you have some abstract system, and you have some inputs that go into the feedback loop, generate some outputs, and then those outputs feed back into an input. Sometimes in the crypto Twitter discourse, you might find the term virtuous flywheel to describe some DeFi token Ponzi-nomics. Or more academically, you might find it in the writing of George Soros, where he used reflexivity to describe the boom and bust cycles of foreign exchange markets. And to this, all I can say is, these are not the feedback loops we're looking for. We're not talking about tokenomics. We're not talking about Ponzi games. Instead, we're talking about cybernetic systems. And cybernetic systems are concerned with measurement and control of complex feedback systems. So in this framework, I've proposed 5 parts to evaluate a cybernetic system. You have control inputs, you have outputs, you have a target of the system, so these would be like your target outputs. You have an unknown function of the system evolution. One common example of this in Ethereum landscape would be like MEV. And you have strategy to adjust the control inputs for the targeted outputs. So how you would change the inputs to get the outputs of the system that you want. And what's really useful about cybernetics is it can help us simulate some of these models and design adaptive control systems, and also help us build more resilient systems, systems that don't break and systems that get stronger, perhaps even anti-fragile. So given these prefaces, I'm going to make a conjecture. And the conjecture is such that if you define a renaissance by notable shifts in art, music, literature, culture, religion, everyday life, you can probably conjecture that we're starting to see one of these renaissance take place in our own lives in modern times. And some of the talks today and this week kind of allude to this. And some of the topics which are bringing this about could be like AGI, life extension, space exploration, synthetic biology, many others not listed here. And in order to cope with some of these challenges or cultural shifts that we're facing, we're going to need some tools, perhaps an enhanced or a different set of tools to survive. But before we can go about solving the world's problems, we need to solve some of our own problems in the crypto industry. We have to kind of clean up our own house, as it were. And three problems which I think are quite relevant today that we see in the current market dynamics are, number one, capital formation, number two, communication complexity, and number three, credible commitments or promises for organizations. And we'll go into the three of these. So capital formation. Oftentimes in this space, builders are faced with a particular dilemma. And the dilemma is usually to take one of two paths. Path one is perhaps more of the altruistic path. You apply for a ton of grants, compete in many hackathons, you position yourself for like GitHub public goods funding, or maybe even like an RPGF round from Optimism or Anoma in the future. This is a very good path to take, but it does have some trade-offs. And the second path is you go to investors and you promise them a token and some blockchain abstraction that's going to allow them to like stake their token or sell it in a liquid market. So let's talk about path one. And we'll use this cybernetic framework that we introduced. So an input could be you make an effort to apply for the grants, you seek out these funding programs. An output could be maybe you get funded, maybe you don't. It doesn't necessarily have to be binary. It could be like you wanted $300,000 to scale out, but you only got 50K, something like this. The target would be the funding objective that you want. The unknown function of the system evolution would be competition, things like alignment, availability of funding, and market conditions. And the strategy, if you're not getting funding, could be to position yourself for these public goods funding by advertising on social media or making forum posts, just word of mouth, going to conferences. Or sometimes like you just might rage quit because it's just too hard. And so the path-dependent outcome of taking this first path is it's often not sustainable for projects that want to scale for mass adoption. So you can hack together something really cool on a weekend, or you can string together grants to get a small team going for a while. But if you want to reach millions of users, oftentimes you do need more capital. And this leads to too much delta between the output and the target. So let's now talk about the second path. In the second path, you make efforts to raise money from investors. Similarly, you might get more funding or less funding than you want, and you're seeing that with some of these like seed rounds and Series A's at these massive valuations. The target might be the funding that you want. The unknown function system evolution might be like competition, narrative wars, memetics, availability of funds, market conditions, right? Like if there's a global market crash, it might affect your ability to raise funding. And your strategy could be, in order to get funding, is build what the VCs want you to build, or pretend until you get funded, and promise a token. And the path-dependent outcome here, it may warp incentives to build something useful. And the downside of this is users don't get what they want, and builders are flush with cash overnight, and sometimes they like buy yachts and retire early and delegate to the community, right? So let's talk about the second problem now. Communication complexity. So all of us today, we all have laptops, cell phones, most of us, and one of the first things that we do is that we open some type of messaging or media application. And if you happen to work in this industry and or around it, there's like 6, 7, 8 ways to communicate with people. And everybody has different preferences. And it's a bit much. And so let's look at the cybernetic framework. So an input would be use multiple apps to communicate. Some of the outputs here are like dopamine drains, fatigue, you become emotional. A target is just you want efficient communication with your colleagues and peers, but It's just hard to get. And then an unknown function of the system evolution could be like likes, retweets, random dialectics, solicitations, gossip, things like this. And your strategy on how to cope with this is often, check all these applications because you want to keep up with your friends and your colleagues, your family members, but it has a cost. And so what this path-dependent outcome leads to is like a Schelling point, which is Twitter. And it just leads to more of the same, and it leads to a lot of dopamine addiction and burnout, which isn't great. So let's go to the third problem. Credible promises for organizations. So both internally and externally. So internally, in a lot of our organizations, we have somewhat of a flat hierarchy. And with a flat hierarchy, oftentimes it's very difficult to understand who's responsible for what, and it's also difficult to hold folks accountable for their commitments. And also for folks within the organization to understand the accountability of those commitments. And externally, it's very difficult to demonstrate competence to other organizations that you want to collaborate with, investors, or just even the real world. So again, let's look at our cybernetic model. An input could be a flat organizational hierarchy. An output could be incomplete work, delayed timelines on shipping things that should be shipped, or even at worst case, a toxic culture, which leads to a lot of employee turnover. A target could be just you want to ship and iterate and satisfy workers and customers. You want to have a great work environment. But an unknown function of the system evolution could be talent gaps. You work on the wrong stuff, employee churn, as I mentioned, or resource misallocation. You wind up spending $100,000 for a podcast appearance, something like this. And a strategy could be you reorg every few months until something works, which, it can work, but it's not great. And to the outside world, you just kind of say, hey, it's all good. We're going to ship at X date, right? TM soon. And the path-dependent outcome is you overpromise or you underdeliver until you ship, or you run out of money and you break. So it's also important to note that these problems aren't just isolated. They actually when you have many of them, they start to interact. And they form these larger feedback loops. And a Japanese meteorologist talked about this phenomena in weather. And to describe two cyclones kind of merging together, he called it the Fujiwara effect. And these two cyclones actually become stronger over time. So we've outlined some of these problems. And I'd be lying to you if I said that I had solutions to some of these. And some of these takes might be a little bit naive. But we're going to try to use protocol tools to design applications to solve some of these problems. And one of those is capital formation, so we're going to suggest public signal. Another one is communication complexity, multi-chat, and for the last one, a tool called promise graph. So public signal. Public signal, in simple, one sentence, is intent-centric Kickstarter with demand-side aggregation and dominant assurance contracts. So what does that mean? So in Kickstarter today, if you want to back a project, or if you're an entrepreneur, we'll flip it, and you want your project funded, you go to the marketplace, you say, hey, I am writing a book, or I'm making a movie, or I'm holding a conference. I'd like some funding for this. And it's up to backers individually to fund your campaign. And if you don't meet your campaign's dollar targeted threshold, you don't get funding. So sometimes what this leads to is entrepreneurs asking for too little and taking on too much for that little amount, or they ask for too much and they don't get funded. And oftentimes, studies have shown there's a strong correlation between the entrepreneur and their ability to get funding based off of their social media. Now imagine if you could take this problem and flip it on its head and allow communities to come together and say, hey, we would like some cryptographic libraries produced, or we would like to fund a research collective working on life extension research, or we would like to build a crypto-native hardware wallet, or we would like to build a crypto-native phone, or snark-proving ASICs, things like this. The idea of this application is it allows users and communities to aggregate demand and express those as intents to qualified entrepreneurs and builders of these things. And so you can meet together in this marketplace. And one cool idea here is that you can use Alex Tabarrot's research of dominant assurance contracts. Now, dominant assurance contracts are these things better known as refund bonuses. And so they did some testing whereby if you as a backer donate to an entrepreneur, you're guaranteed to get some risk-free return back over what you put in. So if you put in $10, you're guaranteed to get $11 back. Now, the entrepreneur takes on a little bit more risk in this model, so you'd probably want to have like some type of quadratic funding or public goods funding to preload that. But the studies actually showed that you went from about 40% funding rate to about a 66% funding rate in the laboratory setting. So very exciting. And we talked about this. There'll be some different types of intents that you could have. You could have an identity-based intent. You'll donate 1 ETH to any project Vitalik donates 1 ETH to. Information-based, incentive-based, or even threshold-based. And this could be kind of like a mock-up. Vitalik logs in. There's a funding feed of different accounts that he's following. You can see some like pending contributions. You could see some recommendations. This could be like an app that you have on your phone, or it could just be like a simple desktop browser application as well. So let's talk about multi-chat briefly. So multi-chat embodies this idea of separating protocol from operators. And so what I mean by that is if you think about a lot of the traditional messaging applications we use in Web 2, there are gated moats that are put up. And it's very difficult for you as a user to take your data from one application to another. And it's also very difficult for you as a user to interoperate with one application to another. And folks like the folks at Matrix have been trying to solve this interoperability problem for a very long time. And kudos to them. They're doing a fantastic job. But it's still a really hard problem. And one of the trade-offs that Signal provides, even though they provide incredible privacy guarantees for users, is they're centralized. And you are relying on Signal to act honestly, which also isn't really great. And so with multi-chat, you'd be able to build a messaging chat-like application over the Anoma peer-to-peer network, and you'd be able to build different interfaces for the different types of communication you want. Different organizations could customize their interface. It could be more Slack-like, Discord-like, Telegram-like. And you'd be able to interoperate with anybody else that's running an Anoma node on the network using a messaging app. And one of the cool things is you'd be able to specify precisely what information you want to reveal to whom. And this is a concept we call information flow control. There's a deep literature in programming language theory that touches on this, and also security research in particular. We have a blog post on our blog if you want to find out more information about this one. And we should have a prototype out fairly soon. And in the article, I do a comparison table and just kind of talk about some of the trade-offs between a theoretical multi-chat Signal and Matrix. The last one I'll talk about is promise graph. So promise graph is a language and a structured accounting logic for making and managing promises in and across distributed organizations. So you could think of it like a dependency graph. So on the end, you could say like, you want to ship ZK EVM, or like you want to ship your project. And then you as the founder of your project, or you as the founding core team, could decide, okay, what are the things that are needed? One could be a specification. One could be a prototype. One could be like marketing and business development. So then these become like subtasks on the graph. And then within these subtasks, you need to define what are the specific tasks that need to get defined, and so on and so forth. So you could think about this kind of like a Patricia Merkle tree. And what's interesting about this is once you get to this subtask level, you start to set up commitments between what's called a customer and a performer. So a customer is somebody that needs something done. So they might need a cryptographic library built. And the performer is somebody that's capable of building this. Now, the customer and the performer are going to negotiate. And the customer could say to the performer, I'd like you to build this library in 3 weeks. And the performer could say, no way, it's going to take me 3 months to do this, and I don't even think it's the right task. So you could have a negotiation process around this to get some clarity. And what's great about this is that other people in the organization can see this commitment. So if they want to collaborate with the performer on something, they know what the performer's workload is. They also know what the performer is working on. And it can reduce conflict within the organization because you can now globally see what people's priorities are. And you can have input. And so it kind of looks something like this, where at the top you kind of have this unplanned customer starts planning, and then you have the negotiation process that I talked about. After the negotiation process happens, you have this progress where the performer is doing the work. And then you get to this review process. So the customer ultimately does review and approve this. But the performer can say to the customer at this point in time, like, hey, you know, I didn't really feel great about this. I don't think I got everything I wanted out of this. Or I don't think this is the right task. I think we actually should do X instead of Y. And in this process, you can do one of two things. You can drop the task altogether, instantiate a new task, or send it back through the feedback loop and have new timing. And this is actually something we've been dogfooding at Heliax right now. Heliax is the company employing people to build Anoma and Namada. And we currently have this built with Git, and we use it with GitHub. We have task actions like creating, planning, starting, completing, confirming, rejecting, and different types of task representations. And we found this to be really helpful for internal communication between research and engineering teams. And since we've started this about 8 months ago, we've iterated on 3 separate versions of our Anoma specifications, and we've iterated on multiple versions of an internal prototype leading up to a decentralized testnet sometime this summer. So very exciting, and we hope to share this with other organizations. We take some inspiration from the informal systems workflow communication and Galloy as well. So what are some takeaways from this talk? We've covered a lot of ground. It was quite abstract and maybe a little bit too ambitious. But a few things to remember if you don't remember anything else. Number one, cybernetics can help us reason about socio-economic systems and problems. There's a lot of feedback loops that are evident every moment of the day. And if we just kind of examine those and the interactions, and we think about the control system, the input and the outputs, we can kind of tweak our strategy to get our outputs more aligned to the end goals. It's also fun to solve real-world problems, and I have a tremendous amount of respect, and I'm humbled by folks that come on the stage and talk about things that they're doing for North Korea liberation. I can't pretend to solve those problems, and I think a lot of builders in this space can't quite pretend to solve those problems yet, but we can solve a lot of our own problems. So I would challenge anybody listening, building in the space, to just think about that. What are some tools that we can build to help people better coordinate within our own ecosystem? And then we can start taking those tools to our communities in the outside world. And we talked about capital formation, communication complexity, and credible promises, and new tools to create new feedback loops. So I'll share with you a brief anecdote before my time is up. This past week I was in Berlin, and I had the privilege of getting to talk with Audrey Tang and Glenn Whale about their new book on pluralism. And one of my learnings in the conversation was that communities are always kind of bundling and unbundling, changing over time based off of how they feel, based off of different factors that are important to them. And very much so with pluralism, we want this idea of kind of a minimal set of shared values that allow us to interoperate with each other. And it's with these minimal shared values that we can then bridge our communication and share some common language. And I think this is like a really noble thing to work for, especially for Ethereum. Vitalik just wrote an article about L2s kind of talking about this. And while there might be very specific differences in some communities about technology or about different ways to proceed with building or community formation, just remember that we're all in this together, and we're just trying to make the world a better place, starting with our own communities. If you have any complaints, feedback, or questions, you can direct them at me. My Twitter handle, Apriori0x. We have a lot of writing and research on these resources for Anoma, and thank you for your time. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Apriori. Thank you very much. Any questions from the field? There we have. Okay, we'll get the mic to you. Question coming up.
Hi, thank you so much for the great presentation. You talked about new feedback loops, and I'm quite interested about examples, if you have anything in like social AI, things that can benefit from provenance and anonymity, decentralization, and all of that.
Yeah, this is a really good question, quite broad. I would say that I'm not really that good a thinker in terms of artificial intelligence. I'm still very much a novice there. But what I would say is thinking about ways to give more power or control back to individuals and to communities, users. I think maybe like a good answer here would be along the lines of DAC, you know, like Vitalik has suggested, basically giving tools to protect the sheep from the wolves rather than like giving the sheep weapons. And I think, you know, if we're going to continue to evolve as a society and kind of escape this like top-down fascist control, we need a lot of preference entropy and we need a lot of tolerance. And I think giving people more tools to express their preferences, whether it be, you know, with LLMs or whether it be with like some human-brain interface, these are things that I think can be helpful in kind of altering the current feedback loops as they exist, because, right, they're like this new evolution of the system that comes in, and then it alters the strategy about how people interact. So I'd say, yeah, like I think Vitalik has a lot of really good ideas in the DACC post that he wrote recently.
Thank you.
Any more questions out here? No? Seems we're good. Well, thank you very much. Stay with us. Short break and upcoming, I think. Thank you, Apriori. A very interesting topic upcoming, so stay with us. Thank you.